The Corn Thicket Podcast with Kyle and Howie, presented by Realtree.
Happy April. It's the end of April, and we are here in the Corn Thicket. I am actually in Missouri, out from Pennsylvania to visit with Kyle, take a couple days of PTO. It's Friday afternoon. We're having some Caribou Crossing, which has one of the better bottles, and especially the little capper on top there. We did not empty this today. Kyle had done that at other times, but we are enjoying that today.
Yesterday. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, yesterday. Yeah. So we are very happy to have Gabriella Hoffman joining us today to talk about some really, really important subjects. Gabriella is a media strategist, a freelance journalist, a podcaster, district conservation, which I thoroughly enjoy. I've caught up on, I think, almost all of them. I hit the last few of them on my way out here on the long drive. I was actually in Nashville for work and then just shot the rest of the way out here, but caught up with those. Angler, gun owner, 2A rights activist, and a hunter as well, right? So welcome, Gabby.
Thanks for having me. It's good to connect. I know we were doing some back and forth, but works out for me, and better late than never. So thank you guys for having me. Happy to chat about everything that you have in mind.
Yeah, awesome. Well, first of all, before we get into the heavier topics, lifelong angler, I understand, and I think you're from California originally. Is that right?
Yes.
So how did you get into that? Who got you into that? I'm sorry.
I feel like a lot of women my age, millennial age women, have their fathers to blame. But it's a good blaming because we still go fishing to this day. But in California, it was just such a perfect backdrop before what people think of California now. It was still quite a wholesome place. I grew up in Orange County. I lived like 15, 20 minutes to the beach. Fishing was really at my fingertips, so there was no excuse to not go fishing. But my father and I did it. He got me interested at age 8. I was fully on board fishing by the time I turned 12 when I landed a very memorable 28.5-inch, 8.9-pound catfish in one of the Santa Ana River lakes. It's like this kiddie pond, but being a 12-year-old, you're still young. It was Memorial Day weekend, and I forever have that memory imprinted in my mind. So I go back to that, and yeah, ever since I've been very dedicated to angling personally. I've done a lot of coverage in the industry too. I don't compete with fishing, but I'm competitive outside of like a Bassmaster or things of that sort. I'm personally very competitive when I go fishing, and it's a lot of fun. It adds to the mix, especially when you're fishing, onshore, offshore, fly fishing. I do that too nowadays. So I do all types of style of fishing. I love it. And it was a gateway into shooting sports and then hunting for me. So fishing has led to other interests as it pertains to the great outdoors. So it's a great, kind of gateway activity. I love it. I don't do enough of it recently since I just got a new position managing energy and conservation affairs for the organization I work for, while still maintaining my freelance business on the side. So I haven't been able to go outdoors as much as I'd like to. I get to go bass fishing in about a week, I think, give or take, in South Carolina. So I'm very excited to make up for the difference there. And yeah, I just love it. And I'm glad I'm able to do it even somewhat professionally, testing products, going to trade shows. And I've done it even for SHOT Show and even some of the big hunting shows too. I've been to SEI a few times. I've gone to the Great American Outdoor Show in Pennsylvania. I've been to SHOT Show 4 or 5 times. So I've had my fill of industry-related conferences, having a bird's eye view into the latest products, talking to the who's who of the industry, whether they're politicians or brand influencers or whoever. So I've had a very unique seat in my young 33 years of life to be able to do this and kind of being a voice for people who feel misrepresented in our industry. So as someone who does the activity, I think it's helpful for my coverage and podcasting. And if you don't have some proximity, it kind of makes it harder for you to relate to people who are outdoorsmen, outdoorswomen. And so having that personal connection, I think, really helps me thrive as a communicator, policy analyst, podcaster, journalist, all of the above. And that's what I feel, it was the impetus behind my lifelong love of the outdoors. And I always credit and go back to, those early days of fishing and try to help get other people on board with fishing too. I love spreading the joy of fishing, shooting sports whenever I can. I can't really do so much on hunting because I still feel like I'm learning myself 6-7 years into hunting. but I still get people interested in that too. I talk to a lot of young women who are not your traditional demographic of outdoor person. And just seeing them interested is kind of nice. Like they see that I could provide a good example, and then they see it's actually not so impossible to be able to take up these hobbies. So if I can be a positive influence, channeling my love of fishing and all these other activities, more than happy to. But I'm so lucky really to do it in my professional life too, and to be in such a position. So thank you for asking that.
Yeah, that's spectacular. I did want to show you, well, since you brought it up, this is my daughter's elk
Oh,
when she was 13. Yeah, so the girl's out in the wilderness taking down. That was her second bull elk actually at age 13.
that's so awesome.
Her first one, I think she was 11. She got with a muzzleloader, both of them in New Mexico. So, yeah, I'm a big fan of getting women in the outdoors. It's kind of funny because I didn't even when she was young, it wasn't even a question. Like, I didn't even think of it, like, oh, she's a girl. Is she going to want to go? I was like, she's a kid. She's a kid and she wants to learn about these things. And, she's a badass and it may have something to do with it. Right. I'm sure it's six one, half dozen the other. Um, so you mentioned getting into hunting, recently, 6 or 7 years. And you said, you feel like you have a lot to learn. I've been hunting since I was since I was 12. That's when it was legal to hunt in Pennsylvania back then, back in the old days. Um, and I'm still learning. I still feel like I know nothing. So, if you feel you're going to be on a trajectory to know everything about hunting soon, I need to get on that trajectory because I am not there. I get beaten. We get beaten every year, right, Kyle? I mean,
we've got our butts handed to us the last 2 days turkey hunting.
yeah.
So
Yeah, we're trying to shoot turkeys out here, and they're supposed to be stupid, and they're making us look pretty foolish. But
we did run into some dumb ones today, though.
Yeah, that's true. They were jakes. They're only like 6 months old. So what can we expect? So what got you into hunting? Who introduced you into that? And do you have a favorite species or anything like that for pursuit so far?
That's a great question. So I consider myself a hunter I remember the date when I officially became one, December 2nd, 2017. And that was an upland bird hunt here in Virginia in the Rappahannock River region. And it was actually part of my, at the time, duties for a client I had, a service dog provider association, a great husband-wife duo, and they do like a charity hunt every year. So really early into them doing this charity hunt, I was brought on to help do some supplemental media work for them. And they said, as part of my duty is filming like a little montage of the event. They said, well, we'll also include like a guided hunt for you. And we know it's your first time. And so have at it, after you do your duties. And so I did at the latter half of the hunting event. And it was just, I don't know, it was so spellbinding to be there. It wasn't so cold. It was like maybe 40 degrees, a little icy, but not like bone chillingly cold. And early December, you think most of the country is already blanketed with snow. We just get kind of cold weather here in Virginia. I feel like some parts of Pennsylvania get the same too, but the Mid-Atlantic, not so frigid that time of the year. Sometimes there's anomalies and we do get blanketed with snow, but it's been kind of a low snow, velocity type of season for the last like 5 or 6 or 7 years. I haven't really seen that. But for me, it was a good first experience because the weather conditions were really good. I was very hyped up and psyched mentally because I've learned as I do hunts now, I need to be in the right frame of mind. Not nervous, like I'm not going to mishandle any of the weapons or firearms. Like I'm very well disciplined. So that wasn't an issue for me. But when you haven't done it before, it does seem a little intimidating. And for me, I went to it like having the psyche of like, I'm very excited. It's my first hunt. I can't do anything wrong. I have, only good expectations, expected of me. And we had great people who were doing the, wrangling the dogs, who were the guides too as well. So it was the Rappahannock Bird Dog Club, and it wasn't really like a professional guiding service, but they had clinched a deal with this bird dog club, and the guys are very professional, seasoned hunters, and so it felt like you were with a professional guide service, even though it was members who were volunteering their time. And they had great dogs. I can't recall exactly the breed I was hunting with, but we had good flushers and lots of birds left over because unfortunately on this side of the country, as you probably well know, we have to do a lot of pen raising because we just don't have the habitat necessarily to see or to, let's say, have pheasants or chukar really flourish. We do have some grouse, but like that's in the national forest and they've suffered a little bit with numbers, but we don't have a natural pheasant, chukar, or quail population. So we have to kind of replace it or do, personal raising of it. especially on the eastern side of the United States. We're not like South Dakota. And even with kind of the artificial environments, I still felt like it was a, unique hunting experience. You got to make do with what you have. And to do it on private land was really unique because most of this side of the country, I grew up in California, as you mentioned, and so it's a lot of Western land, public lands, public waters. I've grown up with public waters, but I haven't really done much of public land hunting yet. So I think it was fine as a newbie, adult onset hunter, as they like to say, to start on private land. But I learned like the 3 B's of handling the gun, the butt of the gun, the bead, and then the bird. And for some reason, I just implemented those 3 B's into my shooting. And I was able to get a rooster pheasant, 2 chucker, and a quail. So for a first timer, pretty good.
Yeah.
The dogs were great. So from then on, I've done a couple hunting trips. So I don't really measure like, okay, I've had 50% success here with hunting.
Right.
It's hit or miss, as every hunter knows. But for me, even with the, like, in terms of failures, I think the failures in hunting are not like failures in life, where you can get second chances in hunting. And a failure is actually a teachable moment where if you didn't get something, maybe you saw something unique, or maybe you improved, I don't know, just sitting in a blind, or like got practice sitting in a unique situation. So for me, I was doing deer hunting really early on. And in Virginia, I had 2 misses. One, I took a clean miss using a muzzleloader. And for me at that time, when I did that in, I think, King George's County, kind of close to Rappahannock, with a mentor of mine, an outdoor rider here in the Fredericksburg, Virginia area, I was, a little frazzled because it was an unknown platform for me. So I had a clean miss, thankfully did not injure it. And the second time I did deer hunting, it was near King's Dominion off I-95 at this one property. And we didn't see any deer. We just saw carcasses of deer. So I got to sit in a blind in a stand for the first time. So that was kind of a unique experience. So when it finally came down to clinching my first official deer, 3rd time's the charm, I went to Wyoming, did a little bit of spot and stalk. And it was a 60-degree weather day. It was perfect in the Devil Tower area in the Black Hills of Wyoming. And I went with a couple media policy friends of mine. I don't have kids, I'm not married, but they were doing a father-daughter hunting trip. So they're like, you're a girl, you can relate to, these young women going hunting because you still haven't gone a deer. So we'll have you kind of immersed with them. And I was like, okay, great. Sounds fun. And, doing spot and stalk was really cool. And I didn't flinch. I wasn't nervous. And I finally got the job done. And I actually had no qualms with doing the gutting, the field dressing, like before. And so for me, I was like, I can replicate this, and do this and have the confidence to go with it without getting, nervous or worried about, getting blood on my hands. So it was a kind of full circle moment for that. And, I've had misses with turkey hunting is the most difficult for me. I don't know. I haven't been able to get anywhere near close to a turkey. I've only seen them in the distance. I've seen them I had one in my backyard, an eastern hen, which was so funny. I don't get turkeys in this part of Virginia. They're usually concentrated in the south. But to see one in my backyard was great. And I've seen them roost in the trees too in this urban area. So they do exist here, but you can't really hunt them. They're off limits. In my corner, we're too close to Washington, D.C., so they don't want you to harvest. And we do have bow hunting, but it's for deer and it takes a while to get that. But I've had hits and misses in my 6-7 years of doing hunting. I like duck hunting. It's just harder to do that because you have to go so much. You have to secure spots, and we have duck blind wars here in Virginia, in the coastal Virginia area. And I've heard some crazy stories about duck hunting, outside of the one I've done. So for me, it's a little harder to do goose and duck hunting. I want to do more, but I really do back to your question, because I kind of did a loop-de-loop of my hunting kind of experience and my feelings towards that, and why I think even the failures or the misses or the general experience of hunting to me is equally as gratifying as if I were to, harvest something or notch my tag. And I would actually want to point you to, or mention rather, my dad hasn't done any hunting, but he has a lot of experience butchering, doing some field dressing. My family's from Eastern Europe. They fled the Soviet Union. So my dad hadn't done hunting. We had gotten him to do the hunter's education a few years ago, and we found an opportunity through a friend of mine who has access to a lease to at least get him in the blind to try our hand at hunting for does, because this property needed doe management. But because coyotes had come through the region just as we settled in, we only saw one doe, couldn't take a comfortable shot. But for me, hunting with my father, who's almost 70, was really gratifying, because he taught me how to fish, and that was me teaching him how to hunt and be sit in the blind. You have to be quiet. He's a talker, so it's hard for him to not talk and whisper. So, getting him a little bit acquainted with that even beyond a few of the hunting trips he did in Eastern Europe, that was really nice. So like I could bring my dad with me now to do this, and like he brought me fishing. So I love those kind of little experiences. I've hunted with women, I've hunted with guys, I've hunted with everyone, everyone, young people, old people. And it's really fun. It's a good complementary activity to fishing when fishing's kind of bad or when it's not fishing season. There's always some season. So having a good balance between the two, I think, makes me more well-rounded. I wish I had more meat in my possession. Some friends of mine, as a pity thing, they give me meat sometimes. They're like, "Oh, we know you didn't have a good season, so we'll give you some meat as a consolation." I'm like, "Okay, great." That sounds fine. But I'm hoping this year, even with my crazy schedule, I'm hoping to do a few trips. I do plan to go down to Florida. My friends have an operation called duck ranching, where you're hunting waterfowl on ranch lands, private lands. Obviously still following, all the federal and state rules, flyaway rules, etc. But it's a unique experience because oftentimes, like, farmers and ranchers are maligned as like these bad actors, bad stewards of the environment. But I've gotten to know these people in Florida, and I know plenty of other farmers across the country who I've talked to for interviews or different projects. And they care about the land, I think, more than anyone else, sometimes even more than so-called environmentalists. So they have a really cool system in place in Florida, and they've been trying to get me to come down. And I'm like, I have time in December when season is coming. So I'll make sure to block off a few days to go down and cover it and participate in it. So I at least have one trip, hunting trip planned. I hope I have some deer hunting trips planned. Someone else wants to give me access to their lease in a nearby county. So I'm not, deterred by the misses or the non-opportunities that happen too. But, that's hunting. And fishing too. You have good days and bad days, but they're all teachable moments.
Yeah, and that we've so far teed up about 7 things that I have on my little list here from listening to your podcast, and Kyle knows the topics I love to dive into. I think in particular some of the things you just mentioned there. I'm a father of 2 children. One's 23 and in med school, but she's still my baby girl. And then the 14-year-old boy, almost 15 now. And I think it's ironic that sometimes, and we'll get into the social media aspect of things. I know we want to talk about that a little bit, and the impact of YouTube and that kind of thing on both internal and external perception of hunters, meaning within the hunting community and external to the hunting community. But as a dad, looking back, I was raised with hunting like through my grandpa. My dad didn't hunt or anything, and my brother and I kind of bonded through that and learned it through my grandpa a fair bit. But I can say that with my kids, to your point, and this carries through sports now, and through everything else, school, whatever. But it started with hunting for us. Hunting was our first opportunity to get those kids out there and to have them understand the importance of planning, the importance of studying and knowing what your goal is and how to get there, the importance of consistency and sticking with something, to your point, even through failures. And the other thing that I think was really important through that I think hunting really helps build an understanding in kids or exposes them a good understanding is delayed gratification. We live in a world now where it's like, I want it now. I can go to the store, I can order on Amazon, it's going to be here tomorrow, and I'm going to be mad if it's not here tomorrow, things like that. We're out, we have video of, our son, he's 5. He actually harvested his first deer when he was 5. Our daughter, she kept saying, well, I want to hunt, but she would say it like a week before the season. I'm like, sorry, you didn't do anything this summer, you didn't prepare, etc. But we have him at 5. He's planting food plots in June. He's sweating in April, picking rocks out of that food plot. He's helping fertilize. He had to put the seed down. He had to do all these things, literally helping us build the blinds. And to have that culminate with one shot opportunity for him in October, you're talking months of delayed gratification for something for a kid who a month is like a significant portion of his life, right? He's still pretty young. Yeah. But and I really like your point as well about the failures, because our son's in basketball, baseball, all these things now, and we're very intentional about focusing on embracing failures. Like, the failures are the learning points, right? That's where you can grow. If you win every moment, you didn't learn a thing other than reinforcement that what you're doing is spectacular. And even within that, even within a hunt or even within a game, there were losing moments. There were times where you could have done something a little bit better. Unless the guy you were playing against, the girl you were playing against, didn't score a single point, didn't get a single dribble past you, like, you lost at some point, right? You might have even won the game, but you lost some moments, and how do we learn from that? So it's just nice to hear that, someone that has a platform like you do, that's an ever growing platform, thankfully, takes that understanding and really, really, seems to embrace it. I think that's important. I just see, as a dad, I worry a lot about what these kids are being left. Not even, obviously, I worry about what they have as far as hunting opportunities and sporting opportunities, but just in general, just the way society is approaching life anymore, and what the expectations are, and people feeling entitled and all that kind of thing. I just really think, for us, it started with hunting. It was like, this is the thing where you're gonna, and the best part about it is you can do everything exactly right. You can do everything exactly right and still fail. Right? I mean, that deer can just turn and walk away for literally no reason, and you're like, the wind's right, my stand is right, the conditions are right, everything is right, and that deer is just like, nope. And I think that helps kids develop what they don't have right now, which is coping mechanisms. Right? I mean, they don't know what it's like to fail. They don't know how to pick it up and brush themselves off and say, okay, well, we're going to do it tomorrow, and maybe it'll be a different outcome. So thank you for all you're doing to help preserve some of that, or a lot of that, in the ways you do. I did want to pivot kind of on that topic to some recent news. The Tennessee teachers. I'm sure you saw the legislation that went through for Tennessee teachers for being able to carry concealed weapons with additional training within the schools, which I think is great. And I want to let you go on about that here in a minute. I'm always interested in how we're a very the older our society gets, the more, unfortunately, simple-minded a lot of us, society as a whole, has gotten. Right? It's either X or Y. There's no gray area. There's no one appreciates those conversations where all the important stuff is between the extremes. Right? And I've looked at gun-free zones for quite a while now, and I say, okay, well, we either have, we talk about concealed carry permits, for example, or gun allowed zones and gun free zones, but we talk about it dichotomously. Right? It's either one or the other. You can either have guns or you can't. You either have a permit or you don't. And I've always thought, like, well, what about, like, for schools, if it was like an enhanced gun zone where everyday CCW carriers can't necessarily carry there, but if you undergo specific training, if you do additional training, you basically, in some ways, deputize through the system, where you submit to additional background checks, you submit to a greater level of rigor and training, which is what these teachers are talking about doing. Right? It's not that they can just go get a concealed carry weapon and carry it into the school. They're going to submit to additional psychological training. They're going to submit to additional firearms training, so they know they're basically becoming deputies in some ways, and therefore being allowed to carry. I like that concept. It's saying, there are sensitive areas where, whether we like it or not, the general populace is not going to say we're going to allow general concealed carry in these spaces. I don't think it's likely we win that battle. Right? But to get that concession, like seems to have been happening in Tennessee, where they're saying these teachers, if they want to, not what the progressives say of, oh, we're going to have an 80-year-old library teacher and make her carry a 44 Magnum. Like, no one's saying that. Right? But to allow them to take that additional training, submit to those additional exams, and make sure they're safe people with safe training, and then in that case allow them to carry. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that news that just broke this week.
I haven't come through the specifics in detail, but I have seen the headlines, and I have talked about or written about, trained armed teachers in schools. And I think it's a generally good principle, especially with these areas being hard targets. And we had an egregious case here in Virginia, actually earlier this year, or last year, I think, where a 6-year-old kid brought a gun to school and shot his teacher. But it wasn't so much, it was an egregious act, of course, but the deal is the administration there was covering up this kid being a problem child, and the teacher, I think, sued the school. She left and got, I think, some money, and hopefully they have penalized the mother for reckless endangerment, and I don't know if she was lawfully carrying a gun or in possession of a gun, or if she had a criminal background that preempted her from owning it. But You see those cases and people are like, well, because of that, we can't have, teachers armed. And, Tennessee had that awful shooting with the very questionable assailant. And people were saying, okay, this is a remedy, have armed guards in Tennessee schools. And like you said, it's not going to be every single school. It's not going to be mandated. It's a voluntary option. I have no problem with them doing like a rigorous process, as long as, it's not going through such hurdles where it makes it impossible for anyone to carry. And I know some of the school districts with how they're operating, from my observations in politics, a lot of them have undue control over, certain school districts. So if this is left to the school districts that are anti-gun, generally speaking, my worry is like that could happen. But if there's in Virginia, that's kind of the case. Our school districts have untold amount of power, so we can't get certain improvements over here. But some of them do comply with my governor. But I bet in Tennessee it's something similar, or maybe the governor or the education department has a little more oversight over it. I have to go back through the specifics. But yes, it's better to have someone who is capable and armed. And then I know they often go to some of the mass shootings that had happened in Texas, where there were people, the police, the security guard had arms, or the Parkland shooting too. There were people on campus who supposedly had guns, but they were not, sacrificing themselves as their duty, demands. And they were like, I'm going to rush out. And instead of going into the fight and helping to deter the shooter, there were a lot of failures with that horrific Parkland shooting. Going to the people who even had the gun. So they'll say like, well, this is the reason why we shouldn't do it. But that person was improperly trained, a coward even too, not going into the first line of defense. And so I think states like Tennessee are capable of crafting policy where it is really specific. It does hone in on the fact that you have maybe your former law enforcement, maybe your former special forces, maybe that would give, I don't know if they get an exemption for former military, or how that's going to go. But I have no doubt, because of this and how sensitive it is in Tennessee with that recent shooting in Nashville a couple of years ago, there will be some rigor to it, of course. But I think the schools won't become hard targets. Like I said, as long as there's no infringements to making capable people who should be able to carry concealed, on a university premise, or secondary school premise, I think it's going to be fine. But I think more schools are going to allow it. And even at the collegiate level in Texas, I believe you're allowed to conceal carry as a university student if you have the CHP, the permit. So we haven't seen anything pan out there, especially in Texas recently, in universities. Thank goodness. I mean, outside of crazy protests, anti-Semitic protests that are happening now. But you do see a correlation often. A lot in the media, sadly, don't want to report this. But when you have lawfully owned guns in the presence of lawfully law-abiding citizens, generally speaking, crime is going to be lower. That's what we often see. There's a lot of polling, a lot of data that puts that connection, puts that two and two together. In areas where there are, prohibitions to conceal carry. A couple of years ago, before my current governor, we had state preemption revoked. So I was walking in my town yesterday. I live in Northern Virginia, and my town has these signs that say no guns in public parks. And I'm thinking, what assailant is going to look at this? This is directed towards people like me who have lawful carry permits. But what assailant's going to look and say, oh, you know what? This sign told me I can't do this. I'm going to follow the sign. They're not going to. And actually, crime has increased a lot, partly because of terrible prosecutors or commonwealth attorneys who just don't prosecute the crime. But it's not because of the gun owners. It's the people who use guns in malicious ways who are not gun owners. They're not law-abiding. So you can apply that same principle, I feel like, to schools. And yes, schools are a lot more sensitive because you're dealing with children. But I think there have been too many instances where these schools are such soft targets where people are like, you know what? I would be much more comfortable sending my kid to school than having it become like a maximum security prison, like a lot of schools do sometimes. Sure. In some of these bigger cities. And so, to get away from that over policing component, if you have just a couple people who are adept at, marksmanship in case, as a last resort, you need to have someone on hand who could just stop an assailant immediately and quickly and swiftly. You'll take care of the problem of a would-be school shooter, I think. So it's a practical policy. We're going to see a lot of resistance, I think, to it. Sometimes even in more gun-friendly states, because that's just how, teachers' unions don't like guns because of just how they lean politically for the most part. And so there is going to be that pushback. But I think as people kind of see, there needs to be some practicality back into schools, not like defunding the school police or something of that nature, or even getting rid of, school shooting sports and hunting courses and funding, as the Department of Education did because of this so-called Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. It was a gun control bill that had a lot of unintended but intended consequences to make firearms excluded, or safe handling of firearms excluded from high school. And I think even from some elementary school level, at least an understanding, but middle school, high school, they would have defunded this had they not restored funding last year. So schools, like you said, about kind of coddling of young people and delayed gratification, or like this, a lot of values are missing from the schools. My family was born in the United States. I don't know what it was like to have guns in the classroom. I know in the South and in a lot of states, Midwest, maybe 80s, 70s.
Had them in mind.
Yeah, it used to be commonplace, and you didn't see mass shootings.
Yeah.
When schools were teaching kids how to safely and responsibly handle firearms. So it's interesting that you saw a spike in that, especially as they started to gradually remove, let's say, hunters education courses or safe shooting sports, or even from the classroom. So I never got to experience that, but I have friends, parents who did get to experience, I think even a couple friends who are from the South. I feel like the South generally, in Texas, they understand, like this is a part of our culture and we don't want
I shot deer on the way to school. I mean, I'd literally be driving down the road. I stopped behind the school bus. I looked over. There was a deer along the side of it, like bedded. I pulled over behind the school bus. The bus drove off. I stepped my prerequisite steps off the road in Pennsylvania. For anyone who's listening out there, statute of limitations is long past, but stepped off the road, shot the deer, knew it was down, checked it, went to school, called my parents, said, hey, I need out around 10 o'clock. I have a study hall. They're like, why? I said, I need to go get the deer out of the woods that I shot on the way to school today. And the gun was in the rack on the back of my truck. But to your point, there's a lot of things that have changed. And the one thing that hasn't changed is the availability of guns. So to look at guns and say they're the cause when they didn't change doesn't make any sense. Parenting styles changed, education styles changed, SSRIs changed, SSRIs emerged, and we're not even allowed to ask that question. Like, not even allowed to ask, like, hey, by the way, all these people that are doing all these things, could it be tied to the medications that say they can lead to homicidal and suicidal thoughts? No, we can't ask that question. That's insane. Seems like a logical question to me, but a lot of it, I think, also comes down to it comes back to nuance, right? The conversation we just had about nuance and how people like to have very bipolar approaches to everything, and everything's cut and dry one way or another. And folks look for, in my opinion, they look for an explanation, an easy explanation, something we can say, well, if we just got rid of this, right? And a lot of these things are much more complex than that, right? We're talking about behavioral things, parental and educational expectations, what methods and medications we're using to handle depression and things like that. That gets very, very complicated. People don't like complicated. The other thing that it becomes very long term. It's going to take a long time to actually see if you start winding these things down, and if you start trying to get accountability back into young people's lives and have them understand the value of failure, the value of delayed gratification. Takes a long time to see that. I mean, you're talking about the next generation being the one, if you get it right that time, you're talking about the next generation, and people want something now, right? They want something simple. They want something now. We say, ooh, guns, make those go away. And then there's also that thing, well, those folks, I can't anticipate if they even got their way at any point, God forbid. Well, we tried. We sorry, we did something. And I've said this several times, and it sounds callous, and I know it sounds terrible, but guns, the intention, as we all know, is everyone on this call knows, the intention is the problem. You take the weapon away, you take the tool away, the intention is still there, and there are exponentially more effective ways to create mass casualties than to use a firearm. There are ways that I am glad they don't use, that are readily available at hardware stores, and just there are ways to do things that would make the numbers that you see from these, and the shootings are horrific. Don't get me wrong by any stretch of the imagination, they're horrific. But And I'm not saying we're lucky that they're using firearms in their copycat crimes, which I believe a lot of these are, because it's a way to lash out and get attention and do what, they've seen others do. But if a lot of these folks were to use to apply their intention using other methods, I think the results would be even more catastrophic. And so why don't we look at the intention? Why don't we look at these broken young people and say, okay, what led them down this path that they chose that tool to take these actions, right? And again, coming back to, I think a lot of this is coping mechanisms. I really do. It's like, these are children, these are young people who are lost, that they can't cope with what real life is throwing at them. And for us, for our family, yes, it carries through sport. Yes, it carries through education and expectations of academics, et cetera. But it started with hunting. It started with hunting and fishing when they were 3 and 4 years old, of saying, this is how you work. This is how you fail. This is how you learn from failing. Failing is a good thing. Failing isn't a bad thing. We're not going to protect you from it. We're not going to, mommy and daddy aren't going to shield you from every bad thing in the world. We're going to let those bad things hit you, but obviously at an age appropriate level. We're not going to let you be overwhelmed, things like that. But to pivot, because clearly you and I can talk for hours and hours, and we shall, and we may need to have a few of these if you're up for it. But you mentioned your governor, Youngkin. And I heard on one of your recent podcasts, he recently was pretty awesome, with, I believe, 30 vetoes of, again, language matters, right? Common sense gun laws, which, as you just said about the signs, criminals are going to see that and say, "Oh, good, hardly any, no one in this park is going to be armed. This will be easy." Right. But they refer to them as common sense gun laws. And so just to catch everyone up, he recently, the governor of Virginia, recently vetoed 30 various gun laws. And you can get into that at a high level here. But my favorite part of that was, one of them was, and there were a lot of favorite parts in there, but one of them being that they were going to make it legal to sue gun manufacturers, right, for crimes committed by gun owners, who, by the way, likely did not become gun owners legally. Let's just put that right out there. It's not like they showed up at Ruger and passed a background check and were handed a weapon. These are people buying them out of the back of a Lincoln. And sorry, I've got the dog is barking upstairs. No,
Time
you're
out.
good. Yeah. You can go.
I'll go take care of him.
Dogs are getting excited. But one of the things I really liked was when he said, well, hey, if you're not going to hold the vaccine producers liable, how do you think you're going to hold gun manufacturers liable? And I was like, oh, you after. Like, I love how that pivot was. And a couple things I'd like you to address on that. What I'd like to use that as a launching point for is a conversation about the importance of getting hunters voting. I know we have fewer than 50% of the hunting public typically votes on a consistent basis. But to your point, just these things that your specific governor has done, if we don't keep folks like that in there who are willing to listen to these conversations, have these conversations. And so I'd like to talk about the importance of getting the hunting population voting, and specifically anything we can do as a hunting public to make sure, like, and I'm embarrassed to admit this, and I know I asked Kyle earlier, for Pennsylvania and for him from Missouri, I don't know if hunting is constitutionally protected within my state. I don't think it is, but I know the anti-hunters posing as conservationists, because words are important and they're stealing our word. Conservation is not protecting at all costs. It is management, which we can talk about that too. But sorry, I'm kind of going off on tangents here. But the importance of getting out to vote would be a spectacular thing. I'd like to hear you chat about a little bit, and how they're systematically attacking us through the states that don't have constitutional protections.
That's a good question. And yeah, you're referring to a conversation I had with Luke Hildeman from International Order of Bill. And he used to be with Hunter Nation, which has been doing a big effort, but I think he's going to try to replicate their efforts. But it's been kind of a long-standing conversation that hunters, whether it's general apathy or maybe their hunting season does coincide with election day oftentimes. And so some may put priority into hunting season, or they just feel very disillusioned by their lawmakers. lots of excuses or lots of reasons behind hunter apathy, but it's a population voting segment that should be engaged more. And I feel like a lot of them are. Maybe among the ones I'm, surrounded by, who are very active in terms of hunting, and I know people out west who are similarly, inclined to do. Sometimes we may have some disagreements, but generally speaking, I feel like we have a lot of overlap with that. But hunting, depending upon where you are in the country, I think some may be more privy to voting versus others. Some are more passionate. You have a divide, of course, sometimes between West and East over what is more of a priority. Do you want to protect, access or guns? I don't think you have to choose between the two. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I support the Second Amendment in totality, and also I do want public lands access and private land access too. So I don't know why some people try to make those two interests against one another. But you kind of see out west sometimes that some of the hunters may incline towards like the environmentalists, thinking that they're going to work with them to protect access. But as we've seen at the federal level, and then I'll bring it back down to how it is important, it is important who you vote for Congress and president, obviously, because what we're seeing now in the federal government is a lot of rulemaking being handed down, not overtly, unless you're paying attention to different rules like I am. I'm a weirdo. I like to pay attention to all these crazy dictates that are coming from different agencies that should be respecting wildlife management. But we have seen closures to public land, hunting opportunities. Even if you don't live in Alaska, 60 million acres closed off to caribou hunting is egregious. And could you imagine? I could imagine something like that unfurling here in the lower 48 too. We have seen some gestures there, or similar efforts where there are certain like public land designations, like a national monument in Utah, where they're going to close off Bears Ears, which is a beautiful area. I've been, and I believe it deserves some protection, where there are antiquities, not just a blanket, land grab, all a million acres, off limits to hunting, fishing, recreational shooting. But one of the plans that they're proposing would make it so recreational shooting is prohibited on a place that has been traditionally welcoming. BLM land and Forest Service land should be open to recreational shooting. And there's a big push now to construct more public target ranges in these rural areas, because it's hard, for people to access, and it fits perfectly in line with Pittman-Robertson. Florida just recently, not a public land state, but on a National Park Service area, the Big Cypress Natural Preserve, the federal government just announced, even despite being consulted by a lot of the local Native American tribes, hunters, airboaters, conservationists, they went against their recommendations and are now designating like 100 some odd thousand of the 760,000 acreage. They want to make it wilderness, and wilderness is the most difficult public land to traverse. You can't really access it. Like, there's no bathroom facilities. And so I've seen these little gestures. They're incremental. They may not seem overt, because a lot of the media, the people who are very critical of, certain previous administrations, who are criticizing, like, you stole our land, you did this. And I followed the Trump administration very closely. I didn't see any land taken. Actually, he expanded in a very historic amount the number of acres you can hunt and fish. Like, that's very straight objective fact, whether or not you like the former president. And we see like a chipping away of that. You see a lot of land being closed down. You see different types of like components, like lead, tackle, and bullets, are now going to be prohibited in national wildlife refuges. There's also now this, other kind of like wonky policy where on national wildlife refuges, the priority is not going to be wildlife management. It's to fight like climate change or put like environmentalism above wildlife on these wildlife refuges. And, regardless
so the wildlife refuges will be about climate change. Like, it's not even about the wildlife anymore, right? And I think, again, the language here is important. And one of the things I'd like you to touch on quickly is the rewilding, right? And we can talk about the 30 by 30 of the completely arbitrary, 30% arbitrary, 20-30 arbitrary. It sounds good, and it makes angry white progressives feel like they're doing something. So sorry. But yeah, I feel like they like to scream about things that they're completely uninformed about. We can talk about how they describe ghost guns if we want. But yeah, like rewilding sounds like a wildlife refuge, or rewilding, or the fact that these animal rights extremists are taking the term conservationist and bastardizing it, because it's like conservation is through management. It's through a scientific understanding of what the land will support, and what predatory rates there are and things like that, not letting it go until starvation and other horrible things start having to manage it itself, and all kinds of disease, which they'll say didn't come from a lab. That one actually might not if it came from that. But, you know, the fact that they're stealing all that, but again, like rewilding, it's like common sense gun laws, right? It's that kind of a phrasing where you hear that, you see that you see that on a even as a hunter, if I see that on a headline and I don't know what rewilding is, I think that sounds like a good idea. Like, we're tearing down a strip mall, we're going to make places for animals, right? We're going to have more wild. But to your point, it's more like, no, we're going to block this place off. No one's going to be able to enjoy it. We're not going to manage it at all. We're just am I explaining that correctly? Like, what is the definition of rewilding?
Yeah, like as I mentioned, it's like a wilderness area where
Mhm.
there are some areas that do deserve to be wilderness study areas. Like I would say few and far, but public lands are intentionally for the public, for the enjoyment of all the public. You know, as long as you're respectful and you follow the laws and you know what you're going into across these different tiers of public land, it should be open to the public. But I have seen a drastic decrease in land opportunities. They're trying to make it harder. I know it's very innocuous, but they want to have it so like national park entry. I don't mind paying with a credit card, but for someone who prefers to pay with cash, they want to make it harder for someone who has cash to pay. So people still pay by cash. I think that's a stupid rule that the National Park Service is instituting under this administration. You like you mentioned 30 by 30. That's a whole different animal. We can dedicate a whole podcast to. But it kind of goes back to your original ask of me about, you know, why do you have to care about who you elect? Because you see these dictates from the federal government that pretend to be conservationists, but they're not. They're not engaging with all stakeholders. I've talked to people in the fishing and hunting industry side, you know, those who sit at the table, the policymakers. They have told me they've been slighted and they've been ignored and dismissed, even though they've been actors across Democrat, Republican administrations, been taken seriously. But this one especially, it's even, you know, gone at the wayside compared to even like previous administrations of the same party, where they're not listened to, and they're really listening more so to like these radical environmentalists, these anti-hunters, anti-anglers, and giving more preference to them. That's why you see these nodes to rewilding. But yeah, like I said, I was going to go back to this point, but who you elect federally is important. Congress, you know, you want to keep Pittman Robertson funded. You want to make sure they're not, you know, also they're doing like a lot of relisting of wolves and grizzly bears whose population segments have reached full recovery. And we're seeing, you know, the forced reintroduction of wolves in Colorado at the state level, where the biologists were very turned off to that idea. They said, we are the ones who know the numbers, we know the landscape, and to put that decision to the voters, especially voters who don't understand to that. So what I want to make the point about in terms of who you elect at the state level. So we see something, not only you see threats federally, sometimes through the judicial branch with these sue and settle lawsuits that force these the environmentalists win at the judicial level, and then the federal government writes rules that are favorable to these environmental groups who back this very nefarious stuff and complicated web of connections. But they sue the federal government into supporting these bad policies, which is why you're seeing a loss of hunting and fishing access. And even the ATF has gone even more rogue, I think, than in recent memory, where they're now starting to clamp down on FFL dealers. I talk to people at the National Shooting Sports Foundation. They tell me like it's really hard to deal with Steve Diedelbach and get anything across to them, even though they tell them like, hey, we're very safe, we're responsible, we shouldn't have these attacks regarding liability. We're not the bad people. You guys should be prosecuting, going after the actual wrongdoers, not us. We're partners with you. We're partners with you. And so, you know, even beyond the regulatory framework, you have this where they can't succeed federally because they know that Pittman Robertson is very popular. They may try through lawsuits, but the hunters are starting to hire good lawyers and fight back at the legal level. We do have most members of Congress, I would say, are generally favorable of hunting. Some are not. That just happens. And even some who I thought were pro-hunting are not. You even find sometimes Republicans can be anti-hunting too. It happens because they've been bought by animal rights activists like Humane Society or some others. I could point to several cases off the top of my head of where that's been the case. And sometimes the Democrats a little more pro-hunting. But yeah, no, at the state level, it is really important who you elect to governor, because you're going to feel more of the effects, you know, every 6 months or Pennsylvania, you guys have felt this too. I know there's been debates over funding, and they wanted to get rid of, I think, PR funding for some odd reason, and then thankfully they renewed it, and we're not going to play games with hunting, or I think the Pennsylvania Game Commission funding. So I know in Pennsylvania that's been kind of a battle there. Some people were playing political games of trying to strip funding and make noise about that. And I thought that was very wrongheaded of those individual members to do that. I'm like, that's like the least, like go after the governor's like excesses for gun control or something of that nature. Like don't target, critical conservation funding there. But who you elect as governor is important because they have the power to appoint commission members. And so federally, you're going to, when a bill is passed, sometimes the bill goes into effect 6 months, a year, the next legislative session. Regulations you could feel within, if they're implemented, in a short time, it could be 3 months, it could be immediate, it could be 6 months, unless they're facing. But at the state level, depending upon your state legislature, you can feel the impact of a law within 3 months, depending upon how long your legislative session is. So in Virginia, we have 45, 60-day sessions. So if something passes, by March, it could be felt by July. Or if there's special session in April, something gets passed by then, you'll feel it within 2.5 months. So you're going to feel things at the local and state level a lot more. So who you choose as a commissioner, if they have a decision-making power to determine, extending seasons, shortening seasons, limiting certain types of hunting, but and it's a very powerful position to be in, who the governor appoints, because they decide what type of policies there are, whether it's the board themselves or commissioners themselves. So every state is different. Some people have board members, some have commissioners. I think in Virginia, we have a board of advisors that is part of our Fish and Wildlife Agency, or our DWR, because we've had a name change. The Department of Wildlife Resources used to be Game and Inland Fisheries, but they wanted to make it a little more harmonized. So who you select as a commissioner is extremely important. And that is what animal rights activists have been targeting. They have said that there are different national outfits. There's one in Washington State, Washington Wildlife First. There's another that's New Mexico based it's called Wildlife for All. So they have seen that, okay, we can't win at the federal level. We can't win in the courts. Let's go to the states. Let's try to inculcate people, who may have a sympathetic message about, big game predators or big game animals, and start by chipping away at that. Pull at the heartstrings there. And then trying to shape and influence, commissioners at the state level. So Washington State has been hamstrung by this. California has long had this. I think even since the 90s, when they successfully first banned mountain lion hunting, and it started and devolved from there. You have Oregon. I think they may have a petition that may ban hunting and fishing, according to some weird, kind of statutory wording of this petition. So that could be really lost to the people of Oregon in the, snap.
And you mentioned, I want to jump back real quick to the Colorado wolves thing. I have a gentleman I know a little bit. I know him from Twitter, like as much as you get to know people from Twitter. His name's Brian Westbury. He's a great economist on there, and he lives there, and he lives out of the city, right? And I also lived up in the foothills when I lived in Colorado. It was wild. I didn't have a yard. I had mule deer giving birth in underneath my deck. We had sage, right? I mean, we had mountain lions walk by, much to my wife's chagrin. She was pregnant with our first child, and she knew that was like a dinner bell. So we instantly moved down to the flatlands, literally within like a week and a half. But anyway, that's one of those things where, to your point, and I saw this in Pennsylvania. I want to bring this back to that as well. A couple things from my home state is there's almost like a 6 of one, half dozen the other, like almost you're damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of thing in a way, because when it comes to things like wolf reintroduction, I want my DNR, whether it happens or not, I want my DNR to do it or not do it because they've done thorough scientific investigation that's not just about that one, but it's about the ripple effects. It's about long-term anticipatory studies of predation and other impacts, like across the board, right? It's everybody deals with every little thing like, oh, this is the only place. Well, you've introduced wolves in other places. There's data points you can pull from. You can look at places with the same population densities and make extrapolations. There's things that can happen there, right? But to put that out to the voters,
No.
I've met the people in Denver. I love the people in Denver. Why are they voting on if they're going to be wolves walking by the doors of people who don't live in Denver? Why do you even have a vote on that, right? So in Pennsylvania, just to give a quick story about over there. So my son got his first buck when he was 5, and we actually had a thing where we could mount. The reason I was comfortable with him doing that was, number one, he shot over 600 times as a 5-year-old before the season, and we had it's called an iScope. I don't think they still make them, but it allowed you to mount your phone onto his scope, right? So I could share the sight picture with him. So his scope was actually projected onto the phone. So that meant I didn't have to worry about a 5-year-old going solo into a scope, acquiring his target picture, his sight picture, picking the right line for a crossbow, because that's what he was using. I'm not giving him like a odd 6 or anything. I knew he was steady. I knew he was using the right line. I knew his appropriate point on the animal. Even in the moment where he was going to be excited, I was able to confirm so we could make an ethical shot on the animal. So due to all those things, we were able to do it. His second year, Pennsylvania decided to have a proposal go through that said they had it in their spring session, and they were going to vote on it later to go into effect the next year, where the mentorship. So Pennsylvania is an under 12 state. You'd have to be a mentor, right? You could it was for 10 and up, and I'm like, oh man, this kid loves hunting. And I knew from my daughter, like, they get so involved in other things by the time they're 10, 11, 12. Like, I wanted to get them involved in it early for all the things we talked about already. And so I wrote them and I said, look, this kid's been hunting. Can you grandfather them in? Selfish me, right? Can you grandfather them in? Like, forget those other 7-year-olds that want to hunt. But I have the transcript. It's probably 10 pages of emails back and forth between myself and the Pennsylvania commissioners at the time, discussing the pros and cons. My main point was, you're not saving a single deer, because anyone who is getting a tag for a 4-year-old and not actually having, or a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old, and not actually having that child use it, was already poaching deer. It's not like they were like, oh, you got this new tag that I can say my 8-year-old's going out, so I'm going to go shoot it. They didn't just start doing it. Before, they were using their sister's unused tag, or getting their brother to get a tag who doesn't hunt. Like, they were already poachers. The mentor program didn't create poachers. Maybe a couple, but by and large, those people who are doing that, abusing the mentor system to kill additional deer, are going to still kill those deer. All you're doing is taking kids out of the woods. That was my argument. So we went back and forth about, well, what if we handed one down? Well, what if you have more than one kid? Or, like, my example I gave in that was, so my son's 9 and he wants to hunt. He's been hunting and he's been doing a great job. He's putting all the work in. And I go out on the first day of archery and he can't hunt because he's got something going on. And since you don't allow Sunday hunting in Pennsylvania, and I get a 150-inch whitetail walk underneath me and I shoot it, and I get to be all excited, and then go tell my son he doesn't get to hunt that year. Like, so we went back and forth, and what we ended up landing on was that, and I have the transcripts to prove it. We discussed the whole way through, throwing out all kinds of ideas, and the question came back: are you saving any deer with that? Are you stopping any poaching with that? Are you actually impacting what you're saying, or are you just doing something to make it feel good, right? We landed on, if they're under the age of 7, then you have to hand a tag down. But if they're 7 or older, they can be mentored, because they had examples of like a 3-year-old who supposedly shot a buck with a 30-06. It's like, okay, that dad's an idiot, right? Things like that. But all this to say, I had a great conversation with my commissioners. I had an absolutely great conversation, and they were so thankful. You could tell they were used to being yelled at. They were used to getting emails that are just F you and this and that, just no conversation, no one wanting to talk to them about it. And the one gentleman actually said, we need someone like you who can actually talk to the people we're trying to talk to, and have these, and like, to facilitate these kind of conversations. Now, this is years ago, and I think he's since moved on, but I think that was an interesting point there. But subsequent to that, there were some things that happened that the commission even put out, that we wanted to go this way. We, as an organization, as a scientifically based, and they had all the citations, but we're not going to do that. We're going to do it this way and this way and this way because of public opinion. And I'm sitting there going like, I don't want my game regulations being driven by public opinion.
Right.
Like it doesn't make any sense. We've got people in downtown Philadelphia who have never hunted. They've never done anything. They don't even use the wildlands. They don't walk in those parks. They're opposed to Sunday hunting because, oh, someone's going to get shot. Won't get shot in any of the other states when they have Sunday hunting because you're not out there walking anyway, right? I can go on and on, obviously, on this, especially Sunday hunting. But, but the balance of that is, to your point, if we don't do the voting, if we don't do the proper voting to get the proper folks in there to make the proper placements in those positions, and then it's not any influence of public perception or public input, they could be captured. Right now, you're talking about folks on that commission who are doing the bidding of, let's say, for example, a progressive governor whose idea of wildlife conservation is basically making everything endangered and saying you're not allowed to do anything. And so that's where I struggle. I'm like, I don't want the public to have input to the laws, but I want to make sure the people who do are the right people. But that all comes back to vote the right governor in, right?
Yeah.
So you get the right appointees.
Yeah, and what we're seeing, I think Vermont is the most recent example, and Colorado too, where in the legislature, I think every state is different, but I think the approval of a commissioner or appointment of a commissioner to the board sometimes has to go through the state legislature. And I think in Vermont, they wanted to change the rule so it doesn't have to be someone who has a connection to hunting or fishing. It could be just anyone who claims to be a conservationist, but you change the definition of a conservationist. So it's not someone tied to hunting or fishing. I don't know if they succeeded. Maybe they didn't, because a lot of people were lobbying against that. So I'm hoping it was defeated. I forget what the status of that one is, but there are efforts where who you elect to your state legislature is also important too, because they could vote. Let's say it's like Jared Polis. Like, for example, he's very much captured by the animal rights activists because of his husband. He's a very, very animal rights activist. They've stacked his friends in all these different departments, and that's what's influencing all these, wildlife decisions you're seeing in Colorado for the most part. Or I think they just approve to make Colorado not over the counter anymore for elk hunting? Or is there discussion of that, right?
I've heard that there's discussion. I don't know that went through,
but there is discussion that, and the people were tying it to like, oh, this is funny with wolf reintroduction. Now it's going to be moving from over the counter to this. I don't know what to make of that.
A lottery. Yeah.
To a lottery. So that was an interesting gesture there. But yes, no, you've seen it, through state legislatures, trying to say like, okay, we want to agree with the progressive or anti-hunting governor, and we're going to change what the purpose of the game commission is, which is what you see a lot of these states. New England, I bet you most of New England above Pennsylvania has largely engaged in that, except for New Hampshire. New Hampshire's still pretty okay, and a little bit with Maine too. But out west in the Pacific Northwest, you have seen this very much so. I think you've seen it in Maryland a little bit. I'm a little worried about where it's going in direction with respect to that. But they did allow Sunday hunting in certain areas recently. And Delaware basically allow Sunday hunting too, actually, after having so many years of the blue law in effect. But no, in Washington State, I have friends there who are just waist deep in the battle of trying to fend off all these crazy commissioners. They've been successful in getting some of them removed, or forcing them out, or getting them on the record saying something egregious. So they're fighting back. A lot of people are fighting back, but you're kind of powerless because like the governor is the one who's been appointing these people. He's the crazy climate change governor, Jay Inslee. So it's really not worth getting in, to his orbit. Perhaps I think he's very much influenced by these kind of preservationist wilders. Although they do have a few pro sportsman people, but it's started to heavily skew towards the non-friendly types that are on the commission. And New Mexico is kind of the same way. Colorado, of course.
But all this can be. It feels like a big cog in all this is if your state constitution has protections for hunting and fishing. That feels like, rather than fighting the battle, that's like the big part of the war. And then you can go back and fight those battles where people obviously start chipping at that. but there's a lot of states that don't have that, right? So and that's the ones like Colorado, for example. That's why they're attacking Colorado. Like, it's no coincidence. It's no coincidence that the ones that these agencies and organizations are putting their money and their efforts towards are the ones that don't have those protections, because they know that's where they can get their momentum. So again, I think so. My next question would be: we've established we need to vote. We've established we have to be voting. The hunting public has to be voting and understanding where folks stand, that they're voting for on that front. We also, I believe, need to be writing our congressmen, writing our senators, and saying, hey, we want to make sure we have hunting and fishing captured in our state constitution formally to provide protections for future. Because to your point earlier, and what we've talked about earlier is we worry already now about how these folks look at hunting. How are they going to look at it in 20 or 30 years as fewer and fewer kids are getting involved in it? They're seeing less value in it. They might see value in it as a nostalgic thing that their dad did or their granddad did, but they won't have the will to fight. They won't have that will to go say, this is something I see has value that means something to me. And once we get down to where there's only 10%, 5% that care, you're just going to get bulldozed, right? So based on that, aside from the voting, and calling and writing letters, which I know everybody says, write your congressman. No one actually does it. Just do it. Like, do it. That's what they're literally there for. Like, we need to do that stuff,
Yeah.
What are some of the other, and we'll wrap it up here. I know we're already over an hour. Hope we're going to do this again, because we got to talk about the 30 on 30 stuff, and we got all kinds of stuff we got to talk about. We didn't even get into social media and the impact that that's had on perception. But what are some other either large and or grassroots organizations that, like, I know Ducks Unlimited has been historically very good at fighting the good fight, right? As far as I've understood, my limited exposure to them, I've been to some of their meetings, some of their events and things like that. But how do you recommend, aside from writing, calling, talking directly to your county commissioners, for example, here in Pennsylvania, not here in Pennsylvania, I'm in Missouri, but in Pennsylvania, folks that are accessible like that to carry that torch forward? What organizations have you seen, or that can you recommend, that are effective at getting our interests out there and being represented well in the political space?
Yeah, there are quite a few. I mean, all the nonprofits, the ducks, the elks, the deer groups, they're all pretty good. They engage a little differently than some of the ones I'm going to shout out momentarily, but they have the ear of congressmen, all these groups, generally speaking. But in terms of those who are paying attention maybe to, let's say, rules changes that are happening at the local, state, federal level, three, I would say, and four come to mind. So I mentioned IOTR. They're really fighting to advance the right to hunt and fish. So they're working with a lot of different states, and I think Missouri still needs to have an amendment too. They don't have one as we're talking right now, and they've been a target for a while. There have been some bills, but it hasn't really made any movement. So International Order of T. Roosevelt and their action pack, they're going to be pushing the right to hunt and fish more, which is good, commendable. Something I like to see, and I've gotten to know their people, and I'll get to know more of their staff at some upcoming meetings, because they're doing a lot in Florida to ensure that ballot measure passes. That should be an easy win. I'm hoping in Florida they can do that because of just a lot of overdevelopment and all that. But as it relates to action centers, whether it's the local, state, or federal level, a newer group is called Howl for Wildlife. So they've created this interactive template where you can be from the state or not in the state, and you can make your voice heard. They have a pre-crafted template, and it's sent directly to the bill sponsor or to the person in the district if you are in the state, and it's a very easy, handy thing. And they are able to have impact and measure impact by the number of letters or messages sent. And so people have started to get to know them. They've worked with a lot of different organizations. There's also Sportsman's Alliance. They've been around for a long, long time. They've kept a great eye on stuff at the state level. Any of these ballot measures, of course, they are in the courtroom suing too. Safari Club International is also really good as well. And there are plenty of others too, but I think those are the three. as it relates to like being action oriented. And like I said, all the species groups are really good too, because they're working with those aforementioned groups. A lot of them partner with each other to sue bad legislation or sue bad rulemaking, rather, fight bad legislation, support good legislation, just do general awareness. And I think, maybe not only like going on the defense to protect hunting, but I say on the offense, like this is
Absolutely.
on social media, maybe as a wrapping point. But we as hunters and anglers and shooting sports enthusiasts have a huge opportunity. I have seen on social media the explosion of positive reception, believe it or not, to people who engage in our lifestyle. You see celebrities normalizing it. I don't care for much for this individual, but Justin Bieber and his wife were going fishing. And someone posted one of the videos, and I was like, oh, some celebrities are normalizing our lifestyle. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson is a big, avid bass fisherman too, so he's kind of normalized the activity. A couple Hollywood actors, like Chris Pratt is an avid hunter. So we have seen some like big wig people, whether they're celebrities or you see like influencers who are kind of up and coming, good influencers who are showcasing the hunting lifestyle very positively. And, I hope that they would learn a little bit on the policy stuff. I'm more than happy to be a good ear or a person who can offer advice to these people, because we could use their platforms also to oppose bad stuff, support good things. I hope they would start to get involved that way. I know some people are like, I don't want to touch on politics, even if it's like related to my hobbies, but I think they're going to be soon forced to. So, doing storytelling, going on the offense, and then just highlighting the benefits. And I think the conservation funding component, that's a very convincing point. I talk to people and they're like, no, I didn't think of hunting like this because of excise taxes on guns and ammunition and tackle and licenses, all of this being connected and dispersed to the states according to land area and number of licenses. So we have a lot at our disposal. The benefits are there. It doesn't help us, unfortunately, when you see like these egregious cases. I don't know if you guys saw this, but that torturing of the wolf in Wyoming was
I did.
very.
Yeah, we put that up on our Twitter feed. Yeah.
It very, very
Yeah.
upsetting that, and it doesn't make me support management less of wolves, but I was like, this guy was doing it apparently in that Wyoming region. I learned this from a friend of mine recently, that they have no permit for it, like in this special zone of Wyoming, which is weird. I would feel like you should have something. I don't think it would be as a result of this case study. I don't think they're going to. I think they should put a tag, just make it.
Sure.
It's a small denomination of money, but to prevent stuff like this from happening, because now you're going to have outsiders come to Wyoming again, even though it's a very hunting friendly state. We've seen a lot of outsiders come in and say, hey, game commission, what are you doing? And the penalty was very low too, because it was technically illegal, even though the way
it was possession. It was like possession of a wolf. It was $250. And again, to your point, aside from, how hunters perceive it, non-hunters look at that and say that was a hunter.
Yeah.
Even though he may not be, I don't know whether he was or not. I know he's a business owner, and I hope no one uses that business. That's a fun conversation. I'm not all for cancel culture, but if you're going to do that to an animal, I'll cancel you. So,
What else
but
he does?
yeah, it's terrible.
Animals like that, because they conflate hunting with torturing, but it's like, we're not torturing the animal. We buy the license. We're not doing it off season. We're only taking a certain amount of number of individual species a season.
Yeah.
It's not even that much.
We're managing it. It's not conservation the way they bastardize the term now. So yeah. Yeah, I do know. I did want to extend an offer. You mentioned turkey hunting. If you're ever in the mood to come up to Western Pennsylvania, we have a cabin on a river that we can put you in on a wonderful farm, privately owned. That's just loaded with turkey. And also this year we're going to have corn on that same location, and so black bear. I know you'd mentioned black bear was on your list, so on a previous podcast. So, we'll chat, and if you're interested, we'll get you up in Western Pennsylvania. There's no baiting in Pennsylvania for black bear; it's all free chase. Hunting them in corn is very interesting. That's why we're the corn thicket. They don't come out of the thicket of corn. So, but yeah, I'd like to offer you and anyone that you'd be interested in bringing along with you some turkey hunting in Western Pennsylvania and some bear hunting this fall if you're up for it. So. Yeah, this has been great. I absolutely have loved this conversation. Everyone, make sure you check out Gabriella Hoffman's podcast, The District of Conservation. It's not long form like ours typically are. It's usually about 30 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes a day. Do you do one almost every day?
No, just twice a week. Sometimes when I'm not traveling, I try to keep that. And I also just launched a new women-centric outdoor podcast called the Sportswoman Show too, which is a separate project that I'm doing with a good friend of mine from New Jersey who lives in Alaska. And he's like, you should be doing more of this. And I'm like, yeah, I have like a good rapport with women, and I can speak to myself. But we're highlighting women's stories. I think your daughter will like this, and anyone listening to daughters or wives who like to hunt or are interested. I think it's a little different. We don't talk policy there because I want to like invite as many voices and get unique perspectives on like fishing and all these other outdoor adjacent activities. But that's also something you guys can throw on your radar too if you're interested. And we just launched it about a month ago, and it's a really fun project. That's more on a bi-weekly basis because my schedule has been kind of crazy of late. But no, District of Conservation.
What's the name of that? What's the name of that one again?
The Sportswoman Show.
Okay, awesome. Sportswoman Show. Awesome. Yeah, definitely be checking that out. I'll send it over to my girl too. She'll listen to that. So again, the Sportswoman Show and the District of Conservation, along with all your freelance journalist productions and all those writings. And again, I want to thank you for hopping in the corn thicket here, pulling up a stump in the thicket and chatting about this stuff. Hopefully we can get you on here again. Maybe we'll get you to Pennsylvania. We'll get you on a black bear and a turkey and all that good stuff. But thank you so much for everything you're doing and that you continue to do. And we'll continue to remind our listeners the importance of getting out and voting and influencing, in any way possible to protect, because it's one of those things I think we definitely take for granted. We say, oh, it's going to be there. It's going to be there. It's going to be there. But when you see places like, I lived in Colorado, when you see places like Colorado getting attacked, you would never think, like you mentioned, even Missouri earlier. I'm sitting here in Missouri now. Like, imagine hunting not happening in Missouri, or being like hard, like you live here and you can't get a tag because you've got to go. You had one last year and you only get one every 4 years or whatever they end up doing. Who knows what madness it would be. But if they can do it in Colorado, if they can even try it in Colorado, it just blows my mind. And it just tells you that they're living within the cities, right? And not even looking outside at what the rest of that state looks like and trying to do just whatever they can. So, last thing, I heard this on your podcast. I really like it. So do you have anything else additionally that you want to cover specifically before we let you go here today?
No, I think we covered the gamut, but let's revisit again. And all those ideas sound great. I hope my schedule will be a little more free to do these activities. But more than happy to take up the offer. Pennsylvania is not too far away. But yeah, just there's always something interesting brewing. So I'm trying to be on top of whatever news can come down. So you can count on my podcast, I think, to highlight things that are not really in circulation widely or that may be kind of on the forefront soon. So we like to keep tabs on my show about things that you should be interested in, even if you're not hearing about it. So we like to look for those interesting hooks and stories. So that's kind of where we stand apart from some of the other podcasts that may engage in some outdoor policy work.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen.
All right. Thanks, y'all. Peace.
The Corn Thicket Podcast with Kyle and Howie, presented by Realtree.